Riding south out of Yuma on a September morning in 1883, Cole Harlan saw the Buzzards first. They were working a thermal 3 miles out across the flats, circling in that particular patient way that meant something below was not yet dead but would not be walking anywhere soon. Cole pulled his roan to a stop and counted 7 of them riding the heat updraft, and he sat there long enough to confirm they were not drifting. They were holding position, tightening their loops, descending in increments. Then he turned the roan off the stage road and rode toward them at a trot. The Sonoran desert in September was a particular kind of punishment. The summer monsoons had come and gone, leaving the land briefly green in early August, before the heat stripped everything bare again. And by the 4th week of September, what remained was a country of cracked alkali flats and Ocotillo skeletons, and an air so dry it pulled the moisture from a man's lips between one breath and the next. The temperature at mid-morning was already past 102 degrees by Cole's pocket thermometer, the kind of heat that did not feel like heat so much as pressure, a physical weight pressing down from above and radiating up from the ground simultaneously. The Gila River was 4 miles north, the next reliable water after this, for anyone going south or southwest, was the Tinaja at San Isidro, a natural stone basin set into a volcanic outcropping that held water through most of the year if the summer rains had been adequate. Cole had checked it 2 days prior. It had been barely adequate. The territory of Arizona in 1883 was a place in visible transition, which was another way of saying it was a place caught between what it had been and what it did not yet know how to become. The railroad had arrived 3 years earlier, running east to west along the Gila corridor, and it had changed the logic of nearly everything: the cattle trade, the freight routes, the speed at which men and money moved through the country. Towns that had existed as waypoints on the overland trail now had to reinvent themselves as railroad towns or fade, and some were managing it better than others. Yuma had made the adjustment. It sat on the Southern Pacific Line, had a territorial prison that kept a certain economy of lawyers and guards and supply merchants employed, and functioned as the last real supply point before the crossing into Baja California or east along the river toward Maricopa. South of Yuma, though, the railroad was irrelevant. South of Yuma was a stretch of country that the railroad had not rationalized and that the land itself resisted rationalization. It was Tohono O'odham land in the deepest sense, country that required knowledge that most Anglo settlers did not have, and did not think they needed until they were 3 days in, with no water, and the Buzzards beginning to take an interest. Cole Harlan had been riding this country for 19 years in an official capacity, and for the 7 years before that in capacities that were less official and that he did not discuss. He was the territorial marshal for the Southwestern District, an appointment that covered an area larger than most eastern states, and that paid $140 a month plus expenses, the expenses being a category that territorial accounting treated with considerable flexibility. His jurisdiction ran from the Colorado River on the west to a line roughly paralleling the Santa Cruz River on the east, and from the Gila in the north to the international boundary with Mexico in the south. Within that territory were miners and ranchers and smugglers and reservation Tohono O'odham and Yaqui, who had crossed from Sonora and army patrols out of Fort Yuma, and Mexicans who did not recognize the border as a meaningful concept, which in many practical respects it was not. He was 44 years old and had not been surprised by much since his late 20s. He was surprised now. She was sitting with her back against the north face of a granite boulder at the edge of the Tinaja Basin, which put her in the only shade available at this hour of the morning. She had arranged herself so that her body made a kind of windbreak between the sun and 3 children, who were pressed against her on both sides and in her lap, and when Cole came over the low rise and pulled the roan to a stop 20 feet away, she looked up at him with eyes that had moved past fear into something that was simply accounting. She was assessing whether he represented a threat or a resource, and she was doing it with the clear-eyed calm of someone who had already spent all her fear and had nothing left to spend. Cole stepped down from the roan and did not move quickly, because a person in this condition could make bad decisions if startled, and he had seen what bad decisions looked like at the end of a rifle held by someone too frightened to think. Her name was Margaret Ellen Cortez. She was 29 years old, though she looked older at this moment, and she had 3 children with her, a boy of 8 named Tomas, a girl of 6 named Rosario, and a girl of 3 named Luz, who was asleep against her mother's chest with the total unconsciousness of exhaustion and dehydration combined. Between Margaret's right hand and the granite face of the boulder was a single canteen, and Cole looked at it and could tell by the way it sat that it was nearly empty. Not the rigid bulk of a full canteen, but the soft, slightly dented look of one that held perhaps 4 ounces of water, perhaps less. He did not say anything yet. He went to his saddlebags and took out his second canteen, full, and his first canteen, half full, and he carried them over and set them down within her reach. Then he took his hat off and poured a measured amount from the second canteen into it and held it out to the boy, Tomas, who was staring at him with his father's dark eyes and his mother's jawline. Cole said slow, "Small sips." The boy looked at his mother. She nodded, and the boy drank. That was how Cole Harlan met Margaret Cortez on the morning of September 22, 1883, at a waterhole in the desert 7 miles south of the stage road and 14 miles south of Yuma, Arizona Territory. Margaret Ellen Vasquez had been born in the spring of 1854 in the town of Hermosillo, Sonora, the second daughter of a school teacher named Bernardo Vasquez and his wife, Consuelo, who kept a small herb garden behind their house, and who had taught Margaret to read in both Spanish and the rudiments of English by the time Margaret was 5. Bernardo Vasquez believed in education as a form of resistance to the particular kind of poverty that Sonora offered the working poor, which was a poverty of opportunity as much as of material, and he had taught school for 21 years to the same roster of children who would mostly grow up to work the same land and the same trades their parents had worked, because that was what the economy required of them. Margaret had absorbed her father's belief in learning and her mother's practicality about what learning could and could not accomplish in a world organized to limit the ambitions of people like them. She had married Ernesto Cortez in 1872, when she was 18 and he was 23, a broad-shouldered man who worked as a freighter and who had a reputation for reliability and fairness in his business dealings that Margaret had investigated carefully before agreeing to the marriage. Her mother had said that reputation was more useful than charm in a husband because charm was available at every corner while reliability was genuinely scarce, and Margaret had taken this to heart. Ernesto had charm as well, which was a bonus, but it was his handshake on a contract that had decided her. They had moved north to Arizona Territory in 1876, when the railroads were still being surveyed and there was work for a freighter who knew the terrain and both languages and who could navigate the complicated politics of the border country without making enemies he could not afford. Ernesto had built his freighting business out of Yuma over 7 years, starting with 1 wagon and 2 mules, and building to 3 wagons and a team of 7 animals, with steady contracts hauling goods between Yuma and the mining settlements to the east, and occasional cross-border work that he did not advertise but that the territorial economy depended on. By 1882, they had a house on the east side of Yuma, a proper house of adobe and frame construction with 4 rooms and a covered porch, and Tomas had been born, and then Rosario, and then Luz, and Margaret had thought, carefully and without sentimentality, because she had her mother's practicality about such things, that the life they had built was solid. Then Ernesto had gone south. In the spring of 1883, he had taken a contract to haul mining equipment from Yuma to a silver operation in the Pinacate region of northern Sonora, a route he had run twice before without incident, and he had left in March with 2 wagons and a hired man named Davis. and he had not returned in April as expected, and had not returned in May. And by June, Margaret had received word through a Tohono O'odham trader who came through Yuma that one of Ernesto's wagons had been found abandoned near the Adair Bay salt flats, with the harnesses cut and no sign of the mules or the men. She had waited through June and July. She had paid the wages she owed the two men who had worked for Ernesto, and had sold the contracts she could reassign, and had held the remaining contract in her own name, because in Arizona Territory in 1883, a married woman could hold a business contract if no male relative contested it, and there was no male relative present to contest anything. She had run the freighting operation herself for 2 months, hiring a driver named Pacheco who knew the eastern routes, and she had managed it with the same methodical attention to detail that she brought to everything. But the debt was the problem. Ernesto had borrowed $800 from the First Territorial Bank of Yuma in February of 1883 to purchase the additional equipment for the Sonora contract, and the loan term was 6 months, due in full by August 15th. The collateral was the freighting equipment, the wagons, the harnesses, the tools, and also, through a clause in the paperwork that Margaret had not examined as carefully as she should have, the house on the east side of town. When August 15th came and went without payment, the bank had sent a notice of default. When September 1st arrived, the bank's agent, a man named Cyrus Adwell, who held the title of collection superintendent, and who had executed 31 such defaults in the previous 2 years alone, had come to the house and served Margaret with a formal notice of foreclosure on both the freighting equipment and the house, to take effect on September 30th. The total outstanding was $840, the original principal plus 6 months of interest at 10% annually. Margaret had gone to 3 lawyers in Yuma. The first, a man named Breckenridge on Main Street, had told her that without Ernesto present to renegotiate the terms, the loan was in default and the bank was within its legal rights, and that she might consider surrendering the property voluntarily to avoid the formal proceedings. The second lawyer, a woman named Clara Hirsch, who operated out of a single office above the dry goods store, and who was one of only 3 women practicing law in the territory, had told her that the clause binding the house to the equipment loan was aggressive but not unusual, and that the bank's position was technically sound, though she thought a sympathetic judge might be persuaded to extend the deadline if Margaret could demonstrate the ability to repay within 60 days. Margaret had asked how much that would cost. Clara Hirsch had said $200 for the filing and her time, and if the judge ruled against them, another $150 for the appeal. Margaret had $212 to her name. The third lawyer had not been available. His clerk said he was in Prescott and expected back in late October. So Margaret had made a different decision. She had heard through the same network of traders and Tohono O'odham contacts that had brought her news of Ernesto's wagon that there was a man in the settlements south of the border, a Yaqui intermediary who dealt in information about missing persons and who had helped, in at least 2 cases she knew of, to locate men who had vanished on the Sonora routes. His name was known only as El Ocho, a name given for reasons no one explained directly, and his location was described as a place 2 days south of the international line, near the Pinacate volcanic field. Margaret had decided that if she could reach him, she might be able to find out whether Ernesto was alive, and if he was alive and could be located and brought back, the bank's claim became renegotiable. She had arranged for Tomas and Rosario and Luz to stay with her neighbor, a woman named Dorotea Reyes, while she made the trip. Then Dorotea Reyes had fallen sick with a fever on September 19th, genuinely sick, and there was no other arrangement that could be made in time, and Margaret had looked at her 3 children and looked at the calendar and made the decision that was in many respects the worst decision she had ever made, which was to take them with her. She had a horse, she had a 2-wheeled cart, she had 2 canteens and 4 days of food, and a map drawn by a man who had done the route in early spring when the water sources were fuller, and whose notations she had not entirely understood. She had left Yuma on the morning of September 20th with the children bundled in the back of the cart, and a direction and a plan that had begun to unravel within 24 hours, when the horse threw a shoe on the rocky ground 6 miles south of the stage road, and then, before she could get the shoe replaced, had pulled up lame in the right foreleg. She had left the cart. She had packed what she could carry: the food, 1 canteen full and 1 half full, a blanket, a knife, the map. She had put Luz on her back and taken Tomas and Rosario by the hand and walked south, and then, when the map's markings stopped making sense against the actual country, had turned toward where the map said the Tinaja should be. She had reached the Tinaja on the morning of September 21st with both canteens empty, having given all the water to the children over 2 days, and had found the stone basin with 8 inches of standing water in it, which was enough to drink and enough to wet the blanket for cooling, and enough to fill both canteens. She had been there since mid-afternoon of the 21st. Luz had stopped asking for water, which was not a good sign, but was at least better than crying, and Rosario had developed the glassy quiet of a child who has been frightened for so long that the fear had smoothed itself out into blankness, and Tomas had appointed himself the person responsible for counting the remaining water, which he did every hour with the gravity of a small accountant, reporting the results to his mother in a careful voice. That had been the situation at 7:45 on the morning of September 22nd, when Cole Harlan had come over the rise and seen the Buzzards, and then seen them. He had served as territorial marshal for 12 years, and as a deputy marshal for 7 years before that, and in those 19 years he had developed a clear-eyed view of what the desert did to people who underestimated it. He had recovered 11 bodies in country like this, men and women who had made one wrong calculation in conditions that permitted no wrong calculations. He had also, over the same period, found 18 people alive who had made wrong calculations and survived them, and in every one of those cases, the survival had depended on a specific quality that he had come to think of as the ability to remain useful to yourself, to keep accounting, keep making decisions, keep taking the next available action, even when the available actions were diminishing toward nothing. Margaret Cortez had that quality. He had seen it in the first 60 seconds, the way she had positioned her body to shade the children, the way she had assessed him before responding, the way her voice when she finally spoke was steady and informational rather than desperate, telling him the facts. 3 children, one more functional than the others, last water 4 hours ago. The youngest had not urinated since yesterday evening. These were the relevant facts. She presented them as such. Cole was the son of an Apache woman named Teza, who had raised him in the manner of both her people and the Anglo settlers who were her neighbors, out of practical necessity, and from his mother he had learned a particular discipline around water in this country. It was not a resource, it was the organizing principle of everything, and every decision in the desert was downstream of the question of where the water was and how much of it remained. His mother had also taught him the difference between someone who was frightened and someone who was frightened and still thinking, and Margaret Cortez was the second kind. He had water, he had food, he had a horse and medical knowledge sufficient for what he was looking at, which was moderate dehydration in the children and severe dehydration and early heat exhaustion in the mother, who had given the children her share of the water for at least a day, and perhaps longer. He had done this before. The calculation was not complicated. What slowed him, what made him measure his actions rather than rushing them, was not uncertainty about what to do. It was the recognition that these 4 people were, at this moment, entirely dependent on his decisions, and that this was a state of affairs that could go wrong in several ways if he moved too fast. He had seen rescuers make people worse by rushing the rehydration. He had seen panicked people refuse help from the wrong kind of stranger. He had seen children go into shock from the sudden drop in stress that sometimes followed a rescue, the body finally surrendering what it had been holding together through will. He moved carefully. He gave water in the small, measured amounts that the desert required, not the flooding gulps that thirst demanded. He built a shade using his bedroll blanket and 2 lengths of rope fixed to the boulder, doubling the shadow available. He wet a clean cloth from his saddle kit and applied it to Luz's face and neck, and he watched the small girl's color and breathing for 15 minutes before deciding that she was dehydrated, but not in a crisis that required him to push for Yuma at a dangerous pace. She needed water and shade and rest, in that order. The desert had its own timeline, and it could not always be hurried. He did not ask Margaret to explain herself yet. He had learned this from his mother and from 2 decades of work in difficult country. People in extremity needed to be stabilized before they needed to be debriefed, and demanding an account from someone who was still in survival mode was a way of making yourself feel useful at their expense. He fed the children from his own provisions, dried beef and hardtack and a small measure of dried fruit that Tomas ate, with the focused intensity of a boy who had been hungry for a long time and who was trying to behave with dignity about it. He noticed the dignity and did not draw attention to it. It was not until mid-morning, when Luz had woken and drunk and was sitting upright and tracking the movements of a lizard across the granite face with returning interest, that Cole sat down a few feet from Margaret and looked at her directly. He said, "Where were you going?" She told him. He listened without interrupting, which was a discipline he had practiced for so long it was automatic now. He listened to the part about Ernesto and the Sonora contract, and the wagon found at the Adair Bay Flats. He listened to the loan and Cyrus Adwell and the 3 lawyers. He listened to the decision about El Ocho, and the horse going lame and the cart, and the 2 days of walking, and the last of the water. He did not respond to any of it with the particular kind of sympathy that was really just pity in different clothing. He processed it the way he processed reports, for facts, for the relevant details, for the shape of the problem. When she was done, he said, "The bank deadline." She said, "September 30th. He said, $840. She said, "Yes." He sat with that for a moment. 8 days. $840. Then he said, "El Ocho," and paused. "I know who that is." Margaret looked at him. Margaret looked at him. She had not known, until that moment, that he was a marshal. He had come to her as a man on a horse with water, and she had taken him on those terms, which were sufficient. Now she looked at the badge on his shirt, which she had seen but had not fully registered, and she recalculated. Cole said, "His name is Rafael Soto. He's not in the Pinacate. He's been in Sonoita since July. The man who gave you that location was working from old information or working from something else." He paused. "I know Rafael. He does what you've heard he does. I can send a wire to Sonoita from Yuma." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "And the bank." Cole stood up. He looked south for a moment, which was a habit, a check of the country, the sky, the distance. Then he turned back. He said, "One thing at a time. First we get you to Yuma." Nobody moved for a moment. Then Tomas stood up and shouldered the bundle his mother had been carrying, with the careful economy of a boy who has decided to be useful and is going to be useful without being asked twice. Cole looked at the boy for a moment. Then he put his hat back on and went to the roan. The route back to Yuma took 4 hours at the pace that Luz's condition required, which was a walking pace with Cole's roan carrying Luz and Rosario in front of him, and Tomas walking beside Cole at a steady 3 miles per hour that the boy maintained without complaint. Cole watched the ground and the sky and the temperature and gave water at regular intervals from his reserves, and they reached the stage road by early afternoon, and Yuma itself by 4 o'clock, entering from the south along the river road with the territorial prison visible on its bluff above the town, and the Southern Pacific cars sitting idle on the siding and the town itself producing its late afternoon sounds, a blacksmith, a train whistle in the distance, the particular combined smell of a desert river town. He took them to Dr. Anson Price's office on 2nd Street, where Price examined the children and Margaret and said that Luz needed rest and fluids for 24 hours, and that everyone else was in better condition than they looked, which was not the same as good condition but was not an emergency. Cole paid Price's fee of $4.50 from his own pocket and made sure Margaret knew the address of his office at the Territorial Marshal's Building 3 blocks north. Then he went to the telegraph office. He sent 2 wires. The first was to the Federal Marshal's office in Tucson, requesting verification on a missing persons case involving Ernesto Cortez of Yuma, freighter, reported missing on a Sonora route since March of 1883. The second was to a contact in Sonoita whose name he did not include in the wire itself, asking for Rafael Soto's current location and availability and the state of information regarding the Adair Bay incident. Then he went to the First Territorial Bank of Yuma. The First Territorial Bank occupied a 2-story building on Main Street, a building of dressed stone with a pair of wooden pillars flanking the entrance that were more decorative than structural, an architectural signal that this was a serious institution with serious money behind it. The bank had been established in 1879, 4 years after the railroad survey had made Yuma's growth trajectory clear, and its principal shareholders included 3 Tucson investors and a pair of California banking interests who maintained similar arrangements throughout the territory. It had assets of approximately $400,000 and a loan portfolio that leaned heavily on the mining and agricultural sectors, both of which were volatile in ways that the bank managed by keeping its collateral requirements aggressive and its default procedures efficient. The man Cole needed was not Cyrus Adwell, though Adwell's desk was the one he would eventually visit. The man he needed first was the bank's president, whose name was Gordon Fitch, a 50-year-old man from Cincinnati who had come to Arizona in 1878 with enough capital to establish himself and enough common sense to understand that the territorial economy rewarded people who understood the local context. Fitch had cultivated relationships with the Army, with the territorial legislature, with the major ranchers and mine operators, and he had also cultivated a practical relationship with Cole Harlan, who was the law in the Southwestern District and whose good opinion was worth having. They were not friends, but they were men who understood each other's leverage and had, on 2 separate occasions, been useful to each other in ways that neither of them discussed publicly. Cole walked into the bank at 5 minutes past 5 o'clock, which was technically after the public hours but before the staff had left, and he nodded to the teller, a young man named Hartley, and walked directly to Fitch's office at the back. Fitch looked up from his papers and said, "Cole." Cole sat down in the chair across from the desk without being invited. He said, "Gordon, I want to talk about a loan." Fitch set his pen down. He had known Cole Harlan long enough to understand that when Cole said he wanted to talk about a loan, he was not inquiring about terms for himself. Cole laid out the Cortez situation with the same economy he brought to all such accounts: the loan amount, the collateral, the default, the missing husband, the wire he had sent to Tucson, the September 30th deadline. He did not editorialize. He did not suggest that Cyrus Adwell had done anything improper. The bank's process had been legally correct at every step. He stated the facts and let them arrange themselves. When he was done, Fitch was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The loan is in default, Cole." Adwell followed procedure. Cole said, "I know he did." Fitch said, "We can't hold that property indefinitely. There are carrying costs." "The board," Cole said. "How much to clear it?" Fitch looked at him. He said, "The full balance is $840. Cole said, "I know what the balance is, Gordon." There was a silence in the office. Outside, through the window glass, Main Street was doing its end-of-day business. A wagon turning north. Two men talking in front of the hardware store. A woman with a basket moving at the brisk pace of someone with somewhere to be. Fitch said, "You're paying this woman's debt." Cole said, "I'm inquiring about whether the bank will accept full payment in cash and restore the property free and clear." Fitch said, "The bank will accept full payment. That's not in question." Cole said, "Then we're not having a complicated conversation." Fitch looked at him for another long moment. He was a man who had made a great many financial decisions in his life, and he was reasonably good at reading the room. And what he read in this room was that Cole Harlan had made up his mind in the desert today and had come here to complete a transaction, not to negotiate. He said, "You'd want the deed released in her name." Cole said, "Her name is Margaret Cortez." "That's correct." Fitch said, "I'll need Adwell in here for the paperwork. He's gone for the day." Cole said, "I'll be here at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning." Fitch said, "Cole." But Cole had already stood. He said, "8 o'clock, Gordon," and walked out. He went back to his office and unlocked the lower drawer of his desk and removed a strongbox. And from the strongbox, he counted out the money. He had $912 in that box, which was most of a year's salary, and represented the accumulated savings of a man who did not spend much and had no dependents, and who had been putting money by for no particular purpose other than that his mother had told him a man without savings was a man renting his own independence. He counted out $840 in a combination of 20s and 10s and 5s, stacked it, wrapped it with a length of brown paper from his desk, and put it in the inside pocket of his coat. Then he went to the hotel restaurant on 2nd Street, which served a reasonable supper, and he ate alone and did not think about the money, which was already spent and did not need to be thought about any more. At 8 o'clock the following morning, he walked back into the First Territorial Bank of Yuma. Cyrus Adwell was already there, which told Cole that Fitch had wired him at home or sent someone to his house the previous evening. Adwell was 43 years old, a man of medium height with a clerk's precise posture and the particular careful neutrality of someone who has learned that emotional investment in his work creates complications. He was not a cruel man. He was a man whose job was the execution of financial procedure, and he executed it efficiently. And the fact that efficiency had a human cost was not something his job required him to account for. Cole had nothing against him personally. Also present, at Fitch's request, were the bank's attorney, a man named Whitmore, who sat to the side with a ledger and pen, and the teller Hartley, who stood near the door as a witness. Fitch stood behind his desk. Adwell stood at one side of it. Cole set the wrapped package on Fitch's desk. Fitch said, "Cyrus, count it, please." Adwell opened the package and counted the bills. He counted them twice, methodically, laying them in stacks on the desk surface. The room was quiet while he did this, except for the sound of the bills being separated and placed. A soft, deliberate sound that was the sound of a problem being solved. Adwell said, $840. Correct. Whitmore noted it in the ledger. Cole said, "I want the deed released to Margaret Ellen Cortez, free and clear of any lien, and I want the foreclosure notice voided, the equipment liens as well." Fitch said, "The equipment is part of the collateral." Cole said, "The equipment is how she earns a living. I want the liens released." Fitch looked at Whitmore. Whitmore said, "The payment satisfies the full outstanding balance. The collateral is automatically released upon full payment." Nobody in that room moved for a moment. Then Fitch said, "All right," and nodded at Adwell. Adwell went to the filing cabinet along the wall and retrieved the Cortez folder. He knew exactly where it was, which was not surprising, and he laid the foreclosure notice on the desk and drew a single clean line through it in red ink, and wrote "Paid in full," and the date, September 23, 1883, and initialed it. Then he pulled the deed to the house on the east side, and the equipment lien documents, and voided the liens with the same methodical strokes. Whitmore witnessed each document and signed his own name as witness, and Hartley signed as second witness, and Fitch signed as the bank's officer. Cole picked up the voided foreclosure notice and the deed and the lien releases and folded them together. Adwell said, "Those should go to the property holder." Cole said, "They will." Fitch said, "Cole is the husband." Cole said, "I don't know yet. I sent a wire." He walked out. He went directly from the bank to Dr. Price's office, where Margaret and the children had spent the night. Price met him at the door and said that everyone was better. Luz had slept well and was eating this morning, and there was no sign of lasting damage from the dehydration. Cole nodded and went up the stairs. Margaret was at the small table in the recovery room, feeding Luz from a bowl of corn porridge. Tomas was reading, or attempting to read, a pamphlet about the Southern Pacific that someone had left in the room. Rosario was asleep on the cot in the corner. The morning light through the window was already sharp and white with the desert's particular September glare, but in the room itself it was cool enough to be comfortable. Margaret looked up when Cole came in. She had slept and eaten, and the glassy exhaustion of the previous day had been replaced by the clearer look of someone who has come back to themselves and is now assessing the situation with full attention. She had that quality of readiness, a stillness that was not passivity but potential. Cole sat down in the chair by the door and took the folded documents from his coat. He set them on the table. She looked at them. She looked at him. She picked them up and unfolded them and read them carefully, all the way through, which took several minutes. Her face did not change much while she read, a slight tightening around the eyes when she reached the amounts, a deliberate steadiness that he recognized as the effort required not to show how much something mattered. When she was done, she set the documents down on the table. She was quiet for a moment. She said, "Marshal Harlan." He said, "Cole." She said, "You paid this." He said nothing. She said, "I can repay you. Not immediately, but the freighting contracts, if Pacheco is still available." She stopped. "Then, I will repay this. Every dollar." Cole stood. He said, "Get your children home, Mrs. Cortez." He meant it. He did not wait for an answer. She did not let him leave without saying one more thing. She said his name, Cole, and when he turned, she said, "I need to know about Ernesto." He said, "I know. I'll have an answer on the wire by tonight or tomorrow. I'll come to the house." He put his hat on and walked out of Dr. Price's office and into the September street. He spent the morning doing the work that the detour of the previous 2 days had backed up. A report to Tucson on a cattle theft case he'd been working in the Gila Bend area, a conversation with the Army lieutenant at the ferry crossing about a man wanted on charges out of California who might be moving through the territory, and a survey of the horses at the livery where the roan was stabled. At noon he ate at the hotel restaurant again, the same as the night before, a habit of routine that he had maintained for years as a simple way of limiting the number of small decisions that needed to be made. In the afternoon he went to the telegraph office. There were 2 wires waiting. The first was from the federal marshal's office in Tucson. It said that the investigation into Ernesto Cortez had been filed but not actively pursued due to it being classified as a Mexican territorial matter, that the last confirmed sighting was March 17th at the Sonoita crossing, and that the case remained open. The second wire was from his contact in Sonoita. It said that Rafael Soto was in Sonoita. It said that the Adair Bay incident was known to him, and that one of the 2 freighters, a man matching Cortez's description, had been seen in the company of Yaqui traders moving south toward the coastal settlements in late April, that the man had been injured in an altercation with rival freighters near Pitaquito and had been taken in by a family in a settlement outside of Caborca, and that as of July there was word he was still there, recovering. The wire ended with a note. In the direct telegraphic shorthand that Cole's contact used, that said the man had apparently been unable to send word north because he did not know if his family had received the news of the wagon and had feared they had assumed the worst. Cole sat with this information for a long time. Then he went to the house on the east side of Yuma. It was a well-made house, as he had expected from what he knew of Ernesto Cortez's reputation for care in his work. The adobe walls were thick and straight, and the covered porch faced north for shade, and there was a small garden in the side yard that had not been tended recently. Margaret had had other things to tend, but which showed the evidence of deliberate planting. A pomegranate tree in one corner had produced fruit that had dried on the branch. Cole noted it and did not note anything else because the rest of it was not his business. He knocked. Margaret came to the door. He told her what the wire said. He watched her face as he spoke, the same careful watching that he brought to every situation that required him to understand what was happening in the space between what was said and what was being received. He had told people hard things before, and he had told people good things before, and he had learned that good news, after a long period of bracing for loss, could arrive like a physical blow, the body catching up to what the mind already knew, the grief that had been accumulating in preparation, suddenly having nowhere to go. She put her hand on the doorframe. She stood that way for a moment. Then she said, "Caborca." He said, "That's southeast of here, about 200 miles, a hard 3 days by horse." She looked at him. She said, Is there a way?" He said, "I can send a wire through the Sonoita contact to the nearest telegraph in that region. It may take several days to get through, but if he's there, and he's well enough, he'll get the message." She said, "Tell him the children are safe." A pause. "Tell him September 30th has been handled." Cole looked at her. She said, "He'll know what that means. He'll know I know the deadline." She paused. "He's been living with that. Wherever he is, he's been living with that." Cole said, "I'll send the wire tonight." He did. The answer came back 4 days later, not through the chain of contacts Cole had used, but directly to the Yuma telegraph office, addressed to Margaret Cortez, a message from Ernesto Cortez, sent from Caborca through a line Cole had not known was functional, which told him that his contacts network was somewhat more extensive than advertised. The message said that Ernesto was alive and recovering and would be home before the end of October. He was home on October 27th. Cole was not there when he arrived. He had left Yuma on October 3rd on a case that took him north to the Hassayampa River country and then east along the Gila, and he did not return to Yuma until the second week of November. By then, the Cortez family had been reconstituted in the house on the east side of town, and the freighting business was operating again with a new contract east toward the Maricopa Wells, and the pomegranate tree had been harvested. He knew this because the town told him. Yuma was not a large place, and the return of a man believed dead and the recovery of a business from foreclosure were not small events, and people noticed them and talked about them in the specific way that frontier towns talked about reversals of fortune, with the mixture of relief and proprietary satisfaction that comes from having witnessed something that confirmed a person's belief in the basic fairness of events. Cole heard it at the hardware store and at the hotel restaurant, and from the teller Hartley, who stopped him on Main Street to say, with evident pleasure, that the Cortez account had been brought current and that Mrs. Cortez had arranged a payment schedule for certain other outstanding matters that Hartley was clearly not supposed to discuss, but was discussing anyway because he was 22 years old and still had the habit of sharing good news when he had it. Cole said good and continued walking. He did not go to the house. He had no business there that required his presence, and he was not a man who went places without business. His part in the Cortez situation was concluded. The money had been paid, the documents had been signed, the wire had been sent, and the people in question were alive and housed and employed. These were the relevant outcomes. He went back to the work of the district, which provided new problems at a reliable rate. By the spring of 1884, 6 months after Cole had found the Cortez family at the Tinaja south of the stage road, the freighting operation that Ernesto Cortez had built and that Margaret had held together through the hardest year of her life was running 3 wagons on 2 regular routes, east to Maricopa Wells and north to Wickenburg, and a 4th wagon that Ernesto was qualifying a new driver to run on a route to the Tucson markets. The combined revenue from the 4 contracts was approximately $300 a month, net of expenses, which was more than the business had earned before Ernesto's disappearance. The recovery had produced a discipline, Margaret's word for it, spoken once to Dorotea Reyes over coffee, that had not existed before. A clarity about what each contract needed to be worth, and what each expense was allowed to cost, and where the margin between them lived. The house on the east side of Yuma was paid forward on its other obligations, a small mortgage to a private lender that Ernesto had taken on for the original construction, and by autumn of 1884 the lender, a merchant named Alderate, had accepted a lump payment and released that note as well. The house was free and clear of any claim by December of that year. Tomas Cortez, who was 8 when Cole had found him counting water ounces in the desert with the gravity of a small accountant, had by 1884 appointed himself the unofficial record-keeper of the freighting business, maintaining a ledger that his mother had given him, in which he tracked arrivals and departures, and contract values, with a precision that his father said was terrifying and his mother said was his grandmother's practicality skipping a generation. He knew exactly how much each route earned. He knew the cost of a mule shoe and the going rate for hardtack by the hundredweight, and the difference between a freight contract with penalty clauses and one without. One afternoon in the spring of 1885, Tomas asked his father about the man who had brought them home from the desert. Ernesto told him what he knew, which was what Margaret had told him, which was the facts, the marshal, the tinaja, the water, the walk back to Yuma. Ernesto added the part about the bank, which he had learned the details of only gradually, and which he had taken some time to sit with, because it was a difficult thing for a man to sit with, that someone had paid a debt of his that he could not pay himself. He told Tomas that the marshal had done it without being asked, and without making it alone, and without asking for thanks. Tomas thought about this for a while. Then he said, "Why?" Ernesto said, "I've thought about that. I think he did it because it was the correct thing to do, and because he was in a position to do it, and because some men, when they're in that position, do the correct thing." Tomas said, "Most men don't." Ernesto said, "No, that's what makes it worth remembering." By the summer of 1887, Rosario Cortez was 9 years old, and Luz Cortez was 7, and both of them were in school at the adobe schoolhouse on 4th Street that the territorial government had established for the mixed population East Side neighborhood. Their teacher was a woman named Florencia Mendez, who was 26, and had trained as a teacher in Hermosillo, the same city where Margaret had been born, and who had arrived in Yuma in 1886 with the same combination of practicality and educational idealism that Bernardo Vasquez had passed to his daughter. Florencia Mendez had heard the Cortez story from Dorotea Reyes within her first month in Yuma, and she had kept it in mind the way you keep hold of a story that has in it something you haven't finished understanding. In the autumn of 1887, Florencia Mendez started what she called a business class for the older students. Tomas was 13 by then and attending the Anglo school, but came to her class on Saturday mornings, in which she taught the arithmetic of commerce, the keeping of accounts, the construction of a contract. She said later that the Cortez family had been the reason she started it. She said she had watched what Margaret Cortez had done with numbers and attention during the crisis of 1883, and had thought that every child in that neighborhood should have those tools, because the next Margaret would not always have a marshal riding south out of Yuma at the right moment. Tomas Cortez went east in 1892, at 18, to study law at a college in St. Louis, that accepted students by examination, regardless of their family's origin, provided the examination results warranted it. He paid his own tuition from money he had saved over 3 years, from his work in the freighting business, and from 3 seasons of contract bookkeeping for a mining operation near Gila Bend. He passed the bar in Missouri in 1895 and returned to Arizona Territory in 1896, opening a practice in Yuma that specialized in contract and property law, specifically the kind of contract and property law that pertained to small business owners and families who did not otherwise have access to legal counsel. His first month's client roster included a widow facing a mechanic's lien on her husband's blacksmith shop and a Mexican farmer whose homestead claim was being contested by a land company. He resolved both matters successfully. His office was on 2nd Street. On the wall behind his desk, he had hung a single document in a plain wood frame. It was the voided foreclosure notice from the First Territorial Bank of Yuma, dated September 23, 1883, with Cyrus Adwell's red ink notation, paid in full, and the signatures of Whitmore and Hartley as witnesses, and Gordon Fitch as the bank's officer. The original red ink had faded to a rust color over the years, but it was still legible. People who came into his office sometimes asked about it. He told them it was the first contract in his family's legal history. Cole Harlan remained in the Southwestern District until 1891, when a change in the territorial administration produced a new set of political relationships that made his position untenable in the way that political things become untenable, not through any specific event, but through the gradual accumulation of frictions between a man who operated by a fixed code and an administration that operated by different priorities. He resigned his appointment in March of 1891 and took a position as a scout consultant with the Army out of Fort Huachuca, which suited him better in several respects and which paid slightly less but required less time in towns. He worked that position for 4 years and retired to a small property near the confluence of the Santa Cruz and the Gila in 1895, which was Apache country in the sense that his mother had been Apache, and which was also Arizona Territory, which was as close as he had to a home. He was 56 when he retired and looked, by most accounts, somewhat older. The desert did that to a man over a long career, leaving its marks in the particular leather texture of his face and the careful way he moved in heat, as though he had been paying attention to heat for so long that his body had developed an automatic efficiency in it. He did not talk much about what he had done. This was not modesty, exactly, and it was not reticence for its own sake. He simply did not find that talking about it improved anything, that talking about it could improve. He died in the spring of 1901, at the age of 62, from a fever contracted during a flood survey of the lower Gila Basin that he had joined on behalf of the County Water Authority, because he knew that river country and they needed someone who knew it. He was found in good order, his effects organized, his small property listed in a will that left it to his mother's people's community in a specific and legally binding way that suggested a lawyer had helped him write it. The lawyer's name, noted in the document, was Tomas Cortez, Yuma, Arizona Territory. The funeral was attended by people from 3 different communities and 2 different nations, which was not unusual for a man who had spent 40 years working the boundary country between all of them. Florencia Mendez, who by 1901 was running the school on 4th Street that had grown from its original single classroom into a 3-room institution with 37 enrolled students, wrote a brief account of Cole Harlan for the local paper after his death. She described him as a man who had understood the country he lived in with greater clarity than most, and who had been willing to act on that understanding at personal cost, and who had done so without requiring that his actions be understood or remembered by the people they helped. She wrote this in 2 paragraphs and then wrote a 3rd paragraph that she cut before submitting, because it said what she felt more than what she could demonstrate, and she had been taught by experience that the things you could demonstrate outlasted the things you felt. The voided foreclosure notice in Tomas Cortez's office remained on the wall of that office through Tomas's entire career, which ended with his retirement in 1931 at the age of 57. When he retired, he took the framed document home and hung it in the front room of the house on the east side of Yuma, the same house that Cole Harlan had paid to keep, the same house that Ernesto and Margaret had died in within 3 years of each other in the mid-1920s. The same house that Tomas had bought from his sisters and maintained with the same methodical care that his mother had maintained everything she owned. When Tomas died in 1947, the house passed to his daughter, Elena Cortez Navarro, who was 41 and had been born in that house, and who understood the document on the wall the way you understand things that have always been there, fully, without having to be told. She had heard the story from her grandmother Margaret, who had told it in the flat, specific way she told all important things, without drama, without embellishment, with every fact in its right place. The man at the tinaja, the water in the Roan's canteen, the way he had given it to the boy first, the bank, the $840. Elena Navarro kept the document on the wall where her father had hung it. Her son, Miguel Navarro, was born in 1943 and grew up in that house and attended the school on 4th Street, by then a proper territorial school with 4 classrooms and a library, and heard the story from his mother and from the document itself, which he read at an age when reading a document on a wall is still a meaningful act. He became a lawyer, as his grandfather Tomas had been, and he practiced for 30 years in Yuma, in the same area of the law. Contracts, property, the protection of small interests against large ones, and he kept his grandfather's photograph on his desk rather than the document, because by then the document was a family artifact more than a professional one, and he understood the difference. He told the story to a reporter from the Arizona Daily Star in 1978, who was writing a piece on the centennial of Yuma's incorporation and had asked about the families that had been present from the early years. Miguel Navarro told the story of the tinaja and the water and the marshal and the bank with the same flat specificity his great-grandmother had used, because that was how the family told it, and had always told it, and because flatness and specificity were the only containers strong enough to hold what had actually happened without spilling it into something less true. The reporter wrote it down. When the piece ran, she included 4 paragraphs on the Cortez family and 1 sentence at the very end, which she had put there because she thought it was the right sentence and in the right place. That the document on the wall of the Navarro house on the east side of Yuma was dated September 23, 1883, and that it bore the name of a man who had paid a debt that was not his to pay, and had walked out of a bank in the September heat of a desert town, and had not looked back. In the Tinaja Basin 7 miles south of the stage road and 14 miles south of Yuma, the Stone Basin still holds water through most of the year when the summer rains have been adequate, and there is nothing there to mark what happened on the morning of September 22, 1883, which is the way most true things are, present in their effects, invisible in their origins, held only by the people who know what to look for and what it cost.